Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please let me welcome you here today at the Charles University. And I will just wait a few seconds before you are seated. Okay, I guess we might start. And before we start our today's symposium, I'd like to kindly ask you to call a minute of silence for the victims of the terrorist attack in Manchester. Thank you very much. I have a rather humble role today, and I will just try to guide you through this wonderful event. And I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of His Magnificence Professor Tomáš Zima, Rector of Charles University. Also on behalf of His Excellence Farid Shayev, the Ambassador of Azerbaijan to the Czech Republic. Thank you for coming, Your Excellence, and also chairing the OICPG countries and hosting this event. In cooperation with His Excellency Abdurrahman Salahuddin, Ambassador of Egypt to the Czech Republic. It's also my pleasure to welcome here Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Martin Tlapa. Thank you for coming. And last but not least, Professor Karen Armstrong, our special guest and keynote speaker. Welcome to Prague. As I already mentioned, it's really my esteemed pleasure to welcome you all here, dear guests. And we gathered here to discuss some truly topical issues in today's, let's say, vibrant world, and I do believe it's of utmost importance to turn our attention to the practical cooperation, to mutual understanding of ourselves, to cultural awareness, and also to turn our attention to genuine facts, because we do have a lot of in common, we are cooperating a lot, and it's not about fighting the common enemy, which is endangering the very basic roots of the whole civilized world. So we are going to discuss economic aspects, political aspects, security aspects, etc. But I won't take any more of your precious time, and this is my pleasure to give a floor to His Magnificence Rector Tomáš Zima.
Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to invite you here on the event which organized by the representatives of the Islamic countries taking place in Prague. The university it's a historically place where it's a melting point and place of the critical discussion on the culture, economical, social issues. It's places where the cultures go together and looking for the future, looking what is connected the human mankind in the world. The Charles University is one of the oldest universities in the world and have this tradition from the beginning, from the 14th century, where the many nations coming to Prague to receiving her knowledge, to sharing the knowledge together with the students, professors, and now we have the community of more than 8,000 students, which is coming from 122 countries all around the world, also from the Muslim countries, countries from Africa, America, and mainly from Europe. I think that this event, which we are preparing with the ambassadors of Azerbaijan and Egypt, is important for the discussing the cooperation between the Czech Republic and the Islamic countries together with Muslim countries together for the future. It's one part. It is an economic story, but I think we not have a good knowledge what its historical background, what is the culture tradition in these countries. And I think this event, it's put to the one step in the mosaic of the knowledges and experiences sharing together and have the information to the general public what is really done and what is exists and how we should cooperate for the better future world on our planet. Thank you all of you to coming here. I think that this program, which is well prepared for a variety of areas for cooperation, will be very fruitful for all of us, and also put one piece for the future better world. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, dear guests, and let me now to give the floor to Deputy Minister and the representative of Minister of Foreign Affairs, Martin Tlapa, who will deliver a speech on foreign policy cooperation between the Czech Republic and Muslim countries. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Tomáš Zima, Rector Univerzity Karlova, dear ambassadors, excellencies. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for inviting us to this important event, and I would like to share with you the best wishes from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lubomír Zaorálek, which is, as you know, an important player in enhancing the relations between the Czech Republic and all Muslim countries as representing the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So that's very good events we are meeting here. And I would like also to thanks from my heart to all organizers, the Charles University, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, Prague group. I'm happy that we have a Karen Armstrong here with us, and all excellencies and ambassadors for attending that, and people who are interested to talk about the Czech Republic and the Muslim countries, because it's a topic which is important. The more we will be meeting, the more we will be discussing, I think it will be better to understand each other, and will be very efficient to have a common policy on the topics we are facing and threats we are facing in the global world. There are nearly 2 billion Muslims, men and women today around the world, who enrich our world, their kindnesses, generosity, justice, civil family duty, and faith. Their life express Islam's teaching of acceptance, humility, response to the God, comparison of peaceful coexistence. I think this is important to remember these days, because the people who can agree on that importance of the world and the God's wish is to be peaceful. And we are on the way which is tackling this road. We have a choice between the way which will drastically come us to the darkness of the violence, intolerance, extremist ideology. The second way, which I think we have to remember, repeat, and do, is to intensify our cooperation for the peace, for the modernity, for the progress, the world we can be productive and positive, and to contribute to the others around the world. Effective response to the serious threats we are facing today has to be based on dialogue, on holistic approach, which demand, avoid, which will allow to have a global actions at every level. That's why it's important to me today. to understand more and more each other. The relations between the Czech Republic and the Muslim countries, as you know, in the foreign policy of the Czech Republic are pragmatic, realistic. We are not saying how to govern the power in the countries outside Europe. We would like to share cooperation together in all aspects, people-to-people meetings, in business, in culture, and the cooperation which we can share together. 98% of the victims, or 90% of the victims of terrorism are Arabs. We have to remember that the fighting against this extremism is a common goal. We have to find a way how to be effective on that, to keep this holistic approach. So every threat we are facing now are putting us more and more together. And I think that today is an extra day for sharing that experiences and thinking about the common future. There's a quite positive signal, I think, in the dialogue. The fight against the terrorism in the Middle East seems to be much more brighter today than it was a year ago. We know that the threats in the Daesh and other extremists will be challenging us because the terrorist people will be moving. That's why we need the cooperation on every level of security as well. But I think that nothing has to stop us to be together in this fight. Because as I mentioned, I think that the foreign policy of the Czech Republic has to be based on the values we share in Europe. And this is based on the tolerance, understanding each other, and fighting against the extremists. We can refer to the past when the Muslims did play a very important role in Europe in enriching our culture and cooperation. Don't forget on that, and I wish the meetings today to discuss the cooperation of all aspects, as mentioned, in economy, in business, in people-to-people contacts, in cultural cooperation, students exchange. And I would like, on behalf of my ministry, to share with you that we will be willing and we will be ready to cooperate with all of you on this path. So I wish the great day today to discuss the cooperation between the Muslim countries and the Czech Republic from all aspects. And once again, I would like to congratulate the Charles University and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Prague group for organizing this event today. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister, for all your remarks which touch all important aspects of our joint or mutual cooperation. And now it's time to welcome His Excellency Farid Shayev, who is not only representing Azerbaijan, but also OIC countries.
Дякую, thank you. На зачатку хотел бы подяковать пана ректора за атаке Карлова университет за организацию этой конференции. Дальше покрачу в английщине. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends and colleagues, ambassadors and also students of the Charles University, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to the conference entitled Relations between the Czech Republic and Muslim countries. And indeed, it's important that this conference is organized now at the time when we see the rising tension between different cultures, ethnic groups and religions. I would like also to acknowledge the participation of the delegation from Kuwait, Minister of Islamic Affairs, Mr. Hulayf Al-Atena, and Assistant Undersecretary for Technical Cooperation and External Relations, and Mr. Khaled Al-Omar, Director of External Relations Department. I hope I pronounce your names correctly. If not, please forgive me. The aim of this conference is to shed light into the relations of the Czech Republic with the Muslim countries, to look at the perspective of the possible areas of cooperation, and to promote the positive image of Islam in the Czech Republic, while dismissing the biased stereotypes and misperception that stemming from the lack of knowledge and sometimes from misinformation. That's why the conference is organized at the right time. Unfortunately, some populist politicians around the globe, and also here, trying to use these negative processes, tensions, conflicts, by provoking stereotypes based on religious and ethnic roots, and propagating hatred and intolerance. Our answer to these populists would be to remind them what the founder of the modern Czech Republic, its first president and human rights champion Václav Havel said: truth and love triumph over lies and hate. Today we need to be more responsible than ever before, because some negative tendencies in the world lead sometimes not to interfaith or intercultural dialogue, but to alienation and marginalization of certain groups. We see regularly that in different parts of the world, the conflicts, confrontations, civil wars are generated by lack of understanding between representatives of different religions and different ethnic groups. And now allow me to take off the mantle of the chairmanship of the OIC Prague group and to speak a bit in my personal, capacity of ambassador of Azerbaijan. I would like to mention that Azerbaijan is a member of not only the Organization of Islamic Conference, but also European institutions, such as the Council of Europe and Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So that's, I think, the few Islamic countries. Also, Turkey is a member of both groups. And some, I would like to mention that many Islamic countries, the part of OIC, we are part of different regional organizations. Our partners in Islamic countries in Southeast Asia, like Malaysia, Indonesia, and some others, we are part of the regional groups. The North African Islamic countries, we are also part of the African groups. That's, I think, the nature of Islamic countries. They should not be only termed as Islamic countries, because they have many faces. They include many, embraces many cultures and many civilizations. Yes, it's true that our common denominator is Islam, but in the meantime, countries are cooperating, countries is developing in different directions. I would like to mention also that just today, yesterday, Azerbaijan, we had a closing ceremony of Islamic Solidarity Games. 2017 is declared in Azerbaijan the year of Islamic Solidarity. Within 2 years period, Azerbaijan hosted in 2015 first European Olympic Games and the second, now the Islamic Olympic Games. It's indeed important to know, for example, that the Islamic countries visited fourth Islamic Solidarity Game, conduct regular sports events. I think it's important that in the Czech Republic, especially I would like to address the young generation, because it's you who will carry the leadership of this country. But know that the Islamic countries, they, again, as I said, they work for inclusiveness. They work for cooperation with non-Islamic countries. By concluding, I would like to emphasize one more time the importance of this conference, which brings us together with the intention to look for the ways of better understanding our cooperation and to distance ourselves from the dividing lines. We should focus more on promoting the values that unite rather than alienate us. And at the end, I would like to also to mention that tonight, Embassy of Azerbaijan having National Day reception, and I would like all panelists, moderators, the faculty members to attend our National Day reception. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency, for your speech, but also for the invitation. It's very kind of you. And now it's time to invite His Excellency Abderrahman Salahadin, Ambassador of Egypt, but not only Ambassador of Egypt to Prague, but also dear friend of our university. The floor is yours.
Good morning. I would like to join our chairman and all my colleagues, the ambassadors of the OIC countries in Prague, in thanking Rector Zima and Charles University for hosting and sponsoring our symposium. We are also very thankful to both Foreign Minister Zaoralek and Defense Minister Stropnicky for designating their distinguished deputies, Mr. Tlapa and Mr. Landowski, to deliver their message of support to our gathering's noble purposes. I also welcome the senior officials of the Kuwaiti Ministry of Islamic Affairs and hope that they will come also to address future conferences on the same subject in the near future. The main drive of our conference is to inform the Czech public about areas of cooperation between Islamic countries and the Czech Republic and Europe at large. Muslim populations numbers around the world exceed 1.6 billion people. They are not one homogeneous group of people in terms of their way of life, wealth, level of education, culture, and political views. Even their religious beliefs differ widely. Our highly distinguished keynote speaker, Karen Armstrong, is the best qualified to elaborate on this exact theme. The other speakers will touch upon relations between the Islamic countries and the Czech Republic in areas such as trade and investment, security and defense, culture and education, student exchange and tourism are our best tools to overcome ignorance about each other. Ignorance can only feed hatred and animosity. Trade and investment bring our people together through common interest. In the package in front of you, you should have some trade volume statistics of 2016 between the Czech Republic and each of our Islamic countries. The total represents about 10% of the total Czech trade with the rest of the world. Similar statistics can be cited also in terms of investment. A major area of cooperation is also in our joint efforts to counter terrorism. Muslims have suffered the largest number of casualties of this awful barbaric disease. This is why they are at the forefront of fighting it. Not only militarily, but more importantly, on intellectual and religious grounds. My country, Egypt, is advocating a whole new approach to religious discourse that would encourage the tolerant, compassionate, and moderate interpretation of Islam. Al-Azhar is shouldering its historic responsibility as a major center for religious learning to fulfill this much needed and past due task. We can only be helped by people of other religions to focus on what all faiths have in common, rather than their differences. Few meters away from here, Charles University is also hosting another conference about the discourse between the tomb and the temple in ancient Egyptian life. Beyond the sheer coincidence of holding two conferences on the same day about the role of the sacred, this also speaks for itself about Charles University's role in addressing scientific, intellectual, and social phenomenon of our time and our past. Rector Zima's leadership in sponsoring and encouraging these thought-provoking and educating activities could not be approved enough. Radical extremists and terrorists are also using the lack of justice and the feeling of misery that prevail among some Muslim and Arab population and the international indifference towards them in order to recruit some misguided and disfranchised young people. A clear and outrageous example is the continued Israeli occupation of the Palestinian land and the lack of progress toward ending that occupation. Or the lack of progress toward ending that occupation and establishing a Palestinian state that would lead to the conclusion of a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace. Egyptian-Israeli peace have helped both countries to use more of their resources to the welfare of their countries and to defend against threats including terrorism. Another source of manipulation available in the hands of these terrorists is supplying foreign funding and fighters to warring parties in civil war-torn areas, such as Syria, Libya, or Yemen, and channel those resources to serve their heinous purposes. No country should provide safe haven, transfer of funds, fighters, or trade for those terrorists under any pretext. The lack of international unity to help resolve those internal conflicts and end their civil wars can only play in the hands of the terrorists. Our common fight against all terrorist organizations should be a global one and not only focused on one or few of these organizations or one or few of its tools. We need to deny terrorists access to web pages, Twitter accounts, and other social media tools as much as we need to deny them weapons and funding. Stereotyping all Muslims as backward, radical, or anti-Western does not do justice to the overwhelming majority of this 1.6 billion people. Lump-summing all Muslims in one category can only help terrorists spread hatred among the mostly peaceful group of different people. To speak about what do Muslims believe in today, we could not find a better authority than Miss Karen Armstrong, a renowned British scholar of religion who started as a Catholic nun and the author of numerous books on religious affairs, including A History of God, The Battle for God, Holy War, Islam, Buddha, Jerusalem between three religions, and this is my favorite, Fields of Blood, and The Great Transformation, only to mention few. Her work has been translated into 45 languages. She has addressed members of the US Congress on 3 different occasions, one of them, I think, on my own invitation, about 16 years ago. After the September 11 attacks, she lectured to policymakers, universities, and intellectual gatherings all over the world. She participated in the World Economic Forum in New York, Jordan, and Davos, addressed the Council on Foreign Relations, and served as an ambassador for the United Nations Alliance of Civilization. Without any further ado, let me introduce Ms. Karen Armstrong.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be for the first time in this very, very beautiful city. I've been greatly influenced in my thinking by the great Canadian scholar of religion at Harvard University, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who died in the year 2000. And as early as in the years before the Suez Crisis, he wrote very, very presciently. He'd witnessed the disaffection in the Muslim world, in the Middle East particularly, and India. And he'd also looked very closely with a dispassionate eye on the behavior of the Western colonial powers in the region. And he said that unless the Muslim world somehow comes to terms with the West, which is a fact of life, it will fail the test of the 20th century. But he also said that unless the West can finally recognize that it shares the planet not with inferiors, but with equals, it too will fail the test of the 20th century. And the events of 9/11 showed that we had not learned these lessons. And what's the great test of the 21st century? One that we're, again, seem to be failing spectacularly. We have created in the West a global market, so that at the same time as we are so perilously divided from one another, we're also bound together more closely than ever before. Our economies are entirely interdependent. When stocks fall in one part of the world, the markets drop all around the globe that day. So interdependent are we. What happens in Syria or Palestine today can have political repercussions, terrorist repercussions in places like Manchester tomorrow. We all face the same environmental catastrophe, and we are also bound together closely on the World Wide Web in a way that giving a proximity to one another that we've never had before. And yet, what's happening is that we are denying this. In the West and Europe, we pride ourselves on our rationality, but what's happening is full-scale psychological denial. The Brexit vote, the withdrawal from the global scene. Scotland is now threatening again to leave the United Kingdom. Wales is talking about following suit. This is a kind of madness. Ever since the Brexit vote, hate crimes in London have increased by 41%. There's a real anger against the other, a fear, a wanting to preserve some kind of national identity. And then, of course, we have Mr. Trump. It doesn't seem so long ago to me before, you remember when the Berlin Wall fell and we were all cheering. Now there's talk of a new wall being erected between the United States and Mexico, and people have been cheering again. Again, an absolutely irrational attempt to ward off the other and preserve a sacred national enclave. Now, nationalism is what we're seeing at the moment, a real toxic and unrealistic and irrational form of nationalism. Nationalism, the creation of the 19th century, I would say one of the really bad ideas of the 19th century, caused 2 major world wars with massive loss of life. And it was, in a sense, it was essential for our industrialization. It was not possible to create a national spirit before the invention of modern communications, newspapers, etc. There's no reason why people living in northern Scotland should feel anything in common with people living in the south of England, when most people never strayed more than 20 miles from their home. All that's changed, and nationalism became popular. But very early in the process, Lord Acton, a British historian, pointed out that nationalism had a fatal flaw, that the emphasis in the nation state on ethnicity, culture, and language would make it very difficult for anybody who did not fit the national profile. He said, with chilling prescience, in some cases, they could either be enslaved or even exterminated. And it was not long afterwards that we saw the massacre of the Armenians in Turkey by the atheistic Young Turks to create a purely Turkic state. And then we had the Nazi Holocaust. A prime example of what happens when rhetoric and fear of the other, refusal to accept the other within the nation, what that can do. And in a sense, nationalism has become a new form of religion. I gather you're not very religious here in Czechoslovakia, but I bet you're not as irreligious as we are in the UK. But nationalism has become a form in which people recognize themselves, feel that they're involved with something larger than themselves. On national days, we have an event called the Last Night at the Proms, a sort of a big bonanza at the end of a season of great sort of performances in the Albert Hall. And there are big screens up at all the big cities of Britain that night, in which we have a famous soprano singing Land of Hope and Glory and Rule Britannia, and everybody's joining in, even in Scotland. Utterly irrational, of course. It's Britannia rules the waves. It's a long time, thank goodness, since Britain ruled any waves at all. But still our hearts swell, and that sense of religious belonging it fills all our hearts. And if you think that it's now no longer respectable to die for your religion, but admirable to die for your country, and if you think that the sacred is something for which you're prepared to die, you can say that for some people, the nation has replaced God. But the nation, as we've just seen, has caused great problems and is doing so more today. Now, we need clear heads. We're in a very, very perilous situation at the moment. And we cannot afford to dump everything, this complex situation that has developed on religion or Islam, about which people talk a lot of nonsense. Bin Laden was always very clear indeed about his political objectives. It was not just about Islam. He was also very, very concerned about Palestine. As the ambassador just mentioned, lies at the heart of much of these problems. He was against the regime of Saudi Arabia and against Western support and interference in Muslim-majority countries. And similarly, the leaders of IS. Many of them were generals in Saddam's disbanded army, which means that they're not devout Muslims necessarily, but secular socialist Ba'athists. You have an unholy mix of bad secularism with debased forms of religion. When recently a journalist from Foreign Policy magazine held meetings with IS supporters in Amman, and he said that for 2 days, none of them raised the topic of religion. Their discourse was almost entirely secular, and interestingly, nobody got up to answer the call to prayer. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Amman, but if you have, you'll know that the call to prayer is absolutely deafening. It's not something you can miss. You have to stop your conversations. But this conversation stopped, but there was no religious desire to pray. Recently, a spokesman for IS spoke to the BBC, and they asked him about religion, and he said, well, no, he hadn't really been drawn to religion particularly. What attracted him was that IS was offering an alternative to the autocratic states that had been established in the region and which, over the years, had received aggressive support from the West. It was a change, a political change, as well as a religious change. So we can't just focus on the religion. We have to take these other grievances, these other problems into account if we're to see our situation rationally, the rationality on which we pride ourselves. After 9/11, various people started to study, forensic psychiatrists started to study these various terrorist attacks. One of them was a man called Mark Sageman, who interviewed in Guantanamo 500 people who had been involved in the 9/11 plot, the atrocity. And Mark Sageman is not a liberal softie like me. He was a former CIA officer. And he concluded that Islam was not the problem. The problem, he said, is not Islam, rather it's ignorance of Islam. He pointed out that of the people he studied, and he's since made studies of all the various lone wolf attempts that have happened since 9/11, he pointed out that only 20% of them had had a regular Muslim upbringing. The rest were either new converts, like the man who just a couple of months ago committed the atrocity in Westminster in London, or who killed the British soldier Lee Rigby. New converts who often come to Islam not knowing much, but angry about something, and often don't know very much about the faith. Or else they were non-observant before they encountered the movement. That applied to some of the leading people in the 9/11 plot. Or they're self-taught. A couple of wannabe jihadis who left Syria from Birmingham in the UK had ordered 2 books from Amazon. One was Islam for Dummies. The other was the Quran for Dummies, which I think gives you some idea of the devotion and knowledge and familiarity with the faith. There's been other surveys too. There was a very important survey undertaken over 20 years or so by a Norwegian scholar in Saudi Arabia, looking at the profiles of the young men who left Saudi Arabia to go, first of all, to Afghanistan at the time of the Soviet War, and later joined Al-Qaeda or fought in Bosnia or Chechnya. And he found again that most of these were not particularly religious or even particularly observant. What disturbed them and what activated them were spectacles of Muslim suffering. In the 1980s, pouring into their television screens, Saudis in their comfortable homes were horrified by what they saw almost daily, pictures coming out of Palestine, things we don't really see over here in Europe. Houses being bulldozed, children being chased or shot by Israeli soldiers. These pictures of suffering left a sense of anger, a sense of despair, anger with their rulers, who were not, they seemed either unable or unwilling to do anything to help their own brothers and sisters. And so if you want a recipe about how to stop terrorism, a major thing would be to stop these images of Muslim suffering. And that doesn't mean just blocking them out of the television. It means stopping the suffering. I mean, I was once an expert witness a few years ago for people in London on a charge of terrorism, and they were had up for selling what was regarded as inflammatory propaganda in a bookshop in Birmingham, and I had to look at all this stuff, look at the videos, and read the text that they were selling. And, you know, these propaganda videos just show one glimpse of horror after another. Young men lying in hospital in Palestine with having lost the sight of their eyes. Children being chased. Piles of dead bodies in Chechnya. Things we don't see, but which are a sore and a trouble. It's the situation for many of them is not dissimilar to what happened in 1967, when hundreds of Jews from all over the Jewish diaspora hastened to Israel at the start of the 1967 Six-Day War, or the number of young men throughout Europe who went to fight the fascists in Spain during the Civil War. There's that same impulse, particularly. One of the things that Mark Sageman, the former CIA officer, found that they did all have in common was a sense of meaninglessness in their lives. I was talking a couple of years ago to one of our chief military philosophers in Britain, and he said that throughout history, the major cause of young men leaving home and going to the battlefield has been boredom, a sense of futility, pointlessness in their lives. And for many of people, like those two wannabe jihadis in Birmingham, there's a sense of that they're not accepted by the host culture, a sense of disempowerment, and a sense of grievance. So again, the recipe is to stop that. Now, there was a very important poll undertaken by Gallup some years ago. It was the biggest poll undertaken ever by Gallup. It took place in 35 Muslim-majority countries over a period of several years. Thousands of people in these countries were questioned. And they were asked, one of the questions was, were the 9/11 attacks justified? 93% of the respondents said no. And the reasons they gave were entirely religious. They quoted the Quran that says that to kill a single person is to destroy the whole world. pointed out that there was nothing in Islam that could justify this. The 7% who said they were justified did not recite religious reasons. Their reasoning was entirely political. And it was Palestine, the same old, really serious grievances, Western support of autocratic regimes, etc. And why are these findings not widely publicized in the Western world, in Europe, in the United States? No one ever seems to have heard of it. It seems buried. One of the things they found was that they asked young Muslims what they most admired about the West. And number one was technology, Western technology, as you can imagine. Number two was Western freedom. Tony Blair famously said, "They hate our freedom." Not true. Muslims would love some of our freedoms that we take for granted, but are not helped to get them. And very tiny percentage of them were at all interested in Sharia, which of course is an absolute obsession with Western people. All convinced that Muslims are all over the world and dying to put into practice a pre-modern agrarian form of legislation. Now this is an example of complete misunderstanding. Sharia law is not a system of jurisprudence. Sharia means the path to the watering hole, originally. It's the right way. It's the way discussed in all, as the Quran would say, in all the great world religions, that by all the prophets that have been taught, a way of justice, of decency, of respect for the other. What is different is jurisprudence fiqh, which interprets Sharia law, just as our Western false jurisprudence does. And that is a human construct, and therefore changeable, not cast in stone. But Western people seem convinced that Sharia law is a sine qua non for which Muslims are prepared to die. The Gallup poll showed that it was of no interest to most of the participants. So we need to inform ourselves. Come back to Wilfred Cantwell Smith for a moment. Seeing other people as equals rather than inferiors. One of the things that disturbs me in the Western European, or at least in Britain, a British response to terrorism, has been a total myopia. As the ambassador just mentioned, far more Muslims have died at the hands of IS than Western people. But we rarely mention them. Before the Paris attack in November a couple of years ago, 2 days earlier, 44 people in Lebanon were killed by 2 IS suicide bombers. And they were never mentioned during the outpouring of grief for the people in Paris. Similarly, if you look at the Paris disasters, in the Charlie Hebdo time, with all that massive bonanza of outcries about freedom of speech and self-righteousness on the part of the West. Shortly before that, 145 Pakistani children, most of them were children, were slaughtered by the Taliban. Little bit of coverage in the press, nothing like the Charlie Hebdo disaster, bonanza in the media. And at about the same time as that Charlie Hebdo catastrophe, Boko Haram slaughtered 2,000 men, women, children, and the elderly in Nigeria. Tiny mention in the press. And this gives a distinct impression, coming back to Wilfred Cantwell Smith, that in Europe and the West, we regard some lives as more valuable than others. And we're often blind to our own behavior. You remember the march for freedom of expression when, in Paris after Charlie Hebdo, when political leaders linked arms and marched for liberté and freedom of speech. Several of them, I noticed, including my own Prime Minister, who was then David Cameron, led countries that had for decades, in Britain's case for over a century, supported regimes in Muslim-majority countries that allowed their people no freedom of expression at all. None of this goes unnoticed in the Muslim world. Shortly after the Charlie Hebdo attack, I was speaking in Jordan to a select group of people. They were diplomats like yourselves, some of you, politicians, members of the royal family. They were not hotheads, and one of them was had been foreign minister who had brokered the peace agreement between the United States and Israel. And he said, the West has lost its humanity. You mourn only your own dead. And the fact that IS is slaughtering Muslims on such a scale shows how un-Islamic it is. It's strictly forbidden to Muslims to fight or kill one another. So, what do we do? I think we have to recognize that something new has happened in the world that we need seriously to think about. What has happened is that the state has lost the monopoly of violence. It is essential for any state that seeks to establish itself to ensure that it controls the violence, military expertise, and weaponry in the country. In the pre-modern world, every single civilization was built on force and massive structural injustice. It doesn't matter whether this was in Africa, the Middle East, or Europe. This was the only way a state could survive that was based on not on industry or technology as we are, but by a surplus of agricultural produce. In each of these civilizations, 2% of the population formed an aristocracy with their retainers, soldiers, officers, etc., priests. And they forcibly seized these agricultural surplus from the peasants and forced them to live at subsistence level in virtual serfdom. And historians tell us that without this iniquitous system, human beings probably wouldn't have progressed beyond a primitive level because it created a privileged class with the leisure to explore and develop the arts and sciences on which our progress have developed. Now, these people, there were always people, prophets and poets and mystics, right back from ancient Mesopotamia, who cried out against this exploitation. But there was nothing they could do because the state had the monopoly of violence. Not any longer. Now, with increased communications, ease of travel, of the easy availability of weapons, and how to manufacture them. The young man who committed the atrocity in Manchester had built quite a sophisticated bomb, and there are instructions for how to do this in your own home on the internet. This is the problem that we're facing. My people came from Ireland, which was, as you all know, ruthlessly exploited by the British for centuries, for 400 years. Some of my forebears came over with the potato famine. And are you telling me that none of those Irish people would have put up with this if they'd been able to get weapons and fight back? But eventually, of course, they did get those weapons. They did fight back. And this is what we're seeing now. And it is something new in the history of civilization and needs careful thought and not something that we could just brush off and put it down to Islam or foreigners or barbarous ideas about, misplaced ideas about Sharia law. We need clear, rational heads. And finally, just a word about myself. I didn't get into this because I'm filled with peace and love. I'm not a particularly peaceable person. I got into it out of sheer dread. This was at the time of the Salman Rushdie crisis, when the Iranian government took out that fatwa against Rushdie for his portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad. I was outraged by the fatwa, which was utterly un-Islamic and definitely anti-Shia. But I was also appalled by the way the great and the good in the UK, leading politicians, philosophers, novelists, and poets, were rushing into print to say that Islam was an evil and bloodthirsty religion, and those were the words they used. And I thought, I had a sense of dread, because I said, we have learned nothing in Europe since the 1930s. This was how Hitler began what he did, by encouraging this kind of bigoted rhetoric so that it became ingrained. And at the end of that decade, the 1990s, there were concentration camps again on the outskirts of Europe, this time with Muslims in them in Bosnia. And we can never say never again. If that could happen in Germany, one of the most civilized and educated countries in Europe, or in Bosnia, where for centuries, despite all the propaganda that Milosevic and people put out, Jews, Christians, and Muslims have been living together peaceably and creatively for centuries. One of the first things Milosevic and co. did was blow up the museums because they contained documentary evidence to show this cooperation. If that could happen there, it can happen anywhere. And so I want to leave with a sense of disquiet, that this is a sense of urgency, because we never want that to happen again, that it is ingrained in the whole national spirit. And I fear for the national spirit that is taking hold of us now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your speech, Professor. And we can open Q&As now. And if there are any questions, please introduce yourself and please try to be as brief as possible. There will be two ladies with mics coming around, so please just raise your hand. Please keep your hand in the air.
What you said, you are basically urging people to be strictly against bad role models. And if I read the history of the life of Prophet Muhammad, I see two people. I see a neutral person in the first half, and after the exile, I see a very bad role model. So do I read your speech correctly, that if we delete this bad role model, so the second part of life of Prophet Muhammad from Islam, we will have a peaceful religion? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm surprised that you say that. I don't think the word role model occurred once in my speech. Certainly role models are good. But again, you have a slight, if I may say so, Rushdie-like view of the Prophet. Peace be upon him. In the early part of the Quran, where the Prophet is in Mecca, he urges peace, you're quite right, because he was in a minority. Jesus was able to maintain a fairly peaceable profile, not entirely, because he had the luxury of not being head of state. All states have to fight to survive. When the Prophet went to Medina, he became head of a mini-state and was facing extermination from the people of Mecca who were out to kill and slaughter the Muslim Ummah in Medina. What nobody takes much notice of is that that is Hudaybiyah, which actually brought peace to the region. 6 years into the crisis, the Prophet announced that he was going to make the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. And this would require that he went into enemy territory unarmed, because on the Hajj you may not carry weapons, you may not even speak a cross word or kill an insect. And people were horrified. They said, Omar, who had become the second caliph, said, we have to defend ourselves. And he said, no, I'm going to make Hajj. 1,000 Muslims, including some women, accompanied him on this dangerous quest. And, true to form, the Meccans sent out the cavalry to slaughter them. Unarmed pilgrims. And unfortunately, some friendly Bedouin took the Prophet and took the company of Muslims into the sanctuary of Mecca, where all violence was forbidden. There they sat down. It was the first sit-in that I know of in history. And they waited. Now, the Prophet was not undertaking a suicide attack. He was thinking very cleverly, because he knew that if the Quraysh, the Meccan grandees, slaughtered 1,000 pilgrims who were peacefully preserving the entire rituals of the Hajj, they would lose all credibility in Arabia. But it was a scary time. The Prophet sent Uthman, his son-in-law, who was an aristocrat, and he knew the ways of the Meccan aristocracy. And word came back that the Quraysh, the Meccans, had killed him. But finally, the Quraysh sent an envoy, Suhail. And to the absolute horror of the Muslim pilgrims, I have to say, who were raring for victory, the Prophet made a treaty that gave away every single thing that they had gained during the war. So much so that they were so offended that they were almost on the point of mutiny. And they came to write the agreement. And the Prophet, as you know, could not write or read. So he asked his son-in-law Ali to write down to dictation the words of the treaty, in which he'd given away every single advantage they'd gained. And the Prophet, and he began by saying, this is the treaty made between the Prophet of God and Suhail of Mecca. And Suhail said, look, I wouldn't have been fighting you all these years if I thought you were the Prophet of God. Cross that out and write the name of your father as usual. And Ali said, look, no, I am sorry, you can't ask me to do this. I absolutely refuse to do it. The Prophet said, show me the words, give me the pen. And he crossed it out, the words out himself, an abdication of ego. Anyway, at that crucial moment, Suhail's son, who had been wanting to convert to Islam for some time and had been imprisoned in his father's house, locked up, arrived on the scene, dragging his fetters, and said, here I am, I've come to join you. One of the things that Muhammad had promised was that if anybody made the hijrah, the emigration to Medina, and said they wanted to be Muslim, they would be sent straight back to Mecca. So Suhail said, well, are you going to keep your word? And Muhammad said, take him back to captivity. They were on the point of mutiny, and the pilgrims, they were so distressed. But then the Prophet, who always took great notice of what his wives thought, went into his wife, one of his most intelligent wives who'd accompanied him, and she gave him some advice. She said, look, let's sacrifice the camels now. It'll give them a sort of sense of something to do and a release. And so they did that, and they went home, and everyone was chuntering and distressed and upset. And Omar was called up to ride with the Prophet at the head of the company. And he thought, uh-oh, because he'd spoken against this whole thing, and he'd spoken against the treaty. He thought he was in for a terrible telling off. And he found the Prophet wreathed in smiles. He said, I have just received a revelation, which says this was a manifest victory, that it was the Quraysh who had behaved with violence, and it was the Prophet, the Muslims, who had behaved like the people of the book. And the first Sirah of the Prophet, Ibn Ishaq, writes that this was the turning point. After this, the word spread in Arabia that the Prophet was the coming man. And 2 years later, Mecca opened its gates voluntarily. Jesus was, as I say, not a particularly peaceable soul, and he was crucified. The Prophet, having been head of state, fought, but said this could be self-defense only, and won through peace with great courage. And I think it represents, again, the difficulty of putting the word of God into practice in a world full of violence. Jesus, the word of God, is crucified by a powerful empire. And where I think the Prophet is a real model is in his revelations. People all over the world right now are very happy to say, without a blinking an eyelid, what they think God wants and what God does, and they're speaking in God's name. Not the Prophet. When he said once, I never receive a revelation without feeling that my soul has been torn from my body. And that we're told in the biographies that he used to faint and grow pale and shudder and struggle, sweat even on a cold day with the effort of bringing forth the word of God. And I think that we, in this moment, those who are religious should be sweating now with the effort to find a solution about how to bring about God, the word of God, in a world full that exists in violence. Every single scripture has to deal with the problem of violence, and does deal with the problems of violence, because it is the main human problem. If a scripture doesn't tackle this problem head on, it'll just be airy-fairy rubbish. And so, you know, we look at Jesus in the book of Revelation, who rides in with a sword to fight the Roman Empire. A massive slaughter outside the Jerusalem in the valley of Gehenna, the revealed word of God, apparently. The prophets of the great warriors of Israel, King David, slaughtered with impunity while setting up a state. We live in a violent world. States are founded on violence, and to somehow manufacture a peaceful process is a jihad in the true sense of the word. It's a struggle.
Thank you for exhaustive explanation. There is a question. Thank you.
Já jsem Petr Masner, dobrý den. I would have two questions, especially to the ambassadors of the Muslim world. What are you going to do about hate preachers? Because what happened, for example, in Manchester, it's not this stupid kid who blew up himself, but it's the hate preachers who actually brainwashed him. But you are foreigners in our countries. And that's the second part of my question. I think it's a lot about money. If Muslims wouldn't have petrodollars, they would be quite poor, and they couldn't come to our countries. Our countries were quite peaceful without you. Now you come as our guests, and you bring your violent religion here.
Please, questions, no comments.
Yeah, two questions. So, first of all, what are you going to do about your own hate preachers? They're your people, your preachers. You want to put up mosques, so how are you going to rein in the hate preachers? Secondly, I think our politicians, our leaders, shouldn't take your money because it's dangerous for our countries what you bring us.
Let's stick to questions. Maybe I would like to ask Ambassador of Azerbaijan, who is representing OIC Group, and if I might translate it, the first goes to the political Islam and abuse of political Islam, and the second goes to funding.
Perhaps I will address the second part of the question, and then I ask my colleague to address the hate preachers. First of all, I would like you speaking about the Czech Republic, we're bringing violence, Muslims, would like to, if you tell me what kind of violence happened here on the hands of Muslims, any terrorist acts happened here in the Czech Republic. It never happened here. Please, I'm now answering the question. Okay, he gave questions, he delivered questions, now I have answered. So I don't think anything happened here in the Czech Republic. We're speaking about Czech Republic. I will address some other countries too. So this is what's happening actually, people like you inciting hatred towards one particular religious group, which actually here in the Czech Republic did not commit any terror act. So that's the fact. The second, violence happened, and I think Miss Karen Armstrong eloquently delivered that in her keynote address. I hope that you listened carefully. That for several hundred years, Western powers, Britain, France, and some other powers, they occupied those countries, including Muslim countries, Middle East. They sacked their resources, including oil. They killed thousands and thousands, not to say million peoples. That you don't count, but then somebody committing some terror act, not in the Czech Republic, but let's say in Britain, in France, in those imperial powers, you think that they are bringing violence kind of in one way. You know, violence happens in both ways. You have to consider it in historical context. And if you count the victims, Christian or Muslims, and here I'm really kind of don't want to say the word Christian because we should not put on the same table Western colonial powers and Christianity. It's two different things. So you will see that much more Muslims died during those colonial period. That's my question to the second part, and now I will pass to Ambassador of Egypt.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all agree with you that we all have a responsibility to speak out against hatred and those who are preaching hatred. And let me tell you a story about how do we do that, especially ambassadors of Islamic countries here. When I first arrived, and in my first meeting of a very small Egyptian community in Prague, very small, 20 people or 25 people, one of them was an imam of a mosque. And he heard that all the Arab and Muslim ambassadors are participating in a charity bazaar. Our wives are donating pieces to be sold for the benefit of orphanages in the Czech Republic, for Czech childs. And the Imam said that we shouldn't do that. Our wives should not donate for something that was under the auspices of a Czech politician who cursed Islam few days before. And the Imam told me, how can you do that? How can you donate to something that is done under the auspices of a politician who would curse Islam? And my answer to him was exactly what you are asking for, that we should actually answer the calls of hatred with a good deed. Ms. Armstrong has always talked about acting versus scripture. And we need all to provide an example of acting against hatred. And I mentioned in my brief remarks that we shoulder our responsibility also to speak against our preachers who promote hatred, because they don't only promote hatred against non-Muslims, they promote hatred against Muslims. You know, ISIS in Iraq and in Syria, they used to slaughter Muslims who would disagree with them about the women dress code, not about anything of major life or death. So we all have common interest. I wholeheartedly agree with you. We should not divide responsibility. We should work together. I would like you to speak as strongly as I do against your own politician who would promote hatred against Muslims. Because otherwise, we could end up repeating the Holocaust experience. Something I think Ms. Armstrong eloquently alerted to. And we should be very responsible toward our people, and especially toward the younger generation. And this is exactly whom we cater for. And I'm very happy to see a few of those faces here. Thank you.
I'd just like to add a word too. I went out to Israel-Palestine in early 1980, knowing absolutely nothing about Islam, tiny bit about Judaism, nothing much about the Arab-Israeli conflict. But I went to make a television program with Channel 4 in Britain on St. Paul. But talking to Palestinians and Israelis, I found they agreed on one thing: how appalling the British had been. And that struck me. This was not the Middle East problem. It was our problem, too. Our behavior there. I speak as a person who loves being British, despite my Irish background of suffering. I love my country. I'm always very happy to go home. But my goodness, the harm we've done. And the same goes for the United States. Iran, for example. The Shahs used to go out in the cause of modernization and suppressing Islam. The Shahs used to go out with their bayonets, taking off the women's veils in the streets and ripping them to pieces in front of them. In 1935, the Shah ordered the police to fire at unarmed demonstrators in one of the holiest shrines of Iran who were peacefully protesting against obligatory Western clothes. Hundreds of Iranians were killed that day. And we condoned that for the sake of, because we wanted oil. We cannot, I mean, what we did in India and Pakistan, we British, the people who set up the border between, the person who set up the border between India and Pakistan had never been to India. He didn't know what he was talking about. And they said in Whitehall, this would be very good because he would be impartial. 1 million people were killed at the time of partition trying to cross the border to go from one state to another, and 7 million people were displaced. And we have the problems in Pakistan still today because of this. So we Europeans, Czechoslovakia, Czech, Slovakia, a lot of people were not involved in all this, but we were in Britain right at the head of it. And we have to take responsibility for the violence and selfishness of our past, which is still going on. We're still supporting rulers we have no business to support, for oil, for strategic reasons, and this is a form of violence too, even though we're sitting smugly at home, thinking how enlightened we are. We have to look. Our pasts now in our interconnected global world are now so closely intertwined that the migrants who are trying to get into Europe every day are coming from countries that we Europeans went and messed up and made virtually unlivable in. Africa, the Middle East. Let's dismantle our self-righteousness on all sides. We all have to do that. No one has the monopoly of either virtue or suffering.
Thank you very much. Okay. And we are almost running out of time, so let's take a very brief question. Let's start with the gentleman in the back in white t-shirt, then you go second and the ladies last.
My name is Milan Rohaj. I have two questions. First is about financing terrorism. It's well known that most of the terrorist organizations are paid from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. What you Muslim countries want to do about that? Second question. I am Christian, practicing Orthodox Christian. I have a question. My fellow believers are killed and oppressed in Islamic countries, and governments are doing nothing about it. So I'm asking you, what can you do about that? I have friends in Syria, in Egypt, in other countries who are Christians, Coptic especially, and they are treated very badly. So that's my two questions.
Maybe Egypt was mentioned, so if Your Excellency, you wanted to start, but please try to stick to some time limits.
Thank you. I hope you noticed not only what I briefly said in my statement about denying terrorists funds, foreign fighters, and other tools that enable them and empower them. If you noticed, 2 days ago, there was a meeting in Saudi Arabia between the President of the United States and all the Muslim and Arab leaders. And one of the basic agreements out of this big gathering was really to agree on ways and means to cut off all funding for suspected terrorists. Because I have to tell you that, like in Christianity, religion is the most powerful tool to raise money anywhere in the world. I think anyone who works in the social field can agree on that. And in our case, in Egypt, for more than 30 years, religious groups were raising money for charity and then ended up being used for illegal political purposes. So there is an agreement across the board by everyone that this should be cut off. And we should restrict not only the bank dealings, but all financial transactions, and cut off what is portrayed as charity, but we don't, again, I repeat again, we should not just compete in dividing blame. We should work together to stop this. And not only funding, because I have to tell you, the transfer of funds and the transfer of foreign fighters didn't only come from the region. It came from the region, but it came also from outside, Western nations, Western citizens, and Western money, and Western weapons. So let us not try to exchange blames. Let us work together. We agree on the problem, that there is a problem. We need to stop it. And let us have a consensus on that. I think the consensus is there and is built up. It is not only weapons and foreign fighters that we need to stop. It's also their access, the terrorist access to technology, access to internet. Can you believe that videos of slaughtering innocent citizens are still on the website for months now, and no one can really shut it off? No Facebook operators or YouTube or you name it and can shut this off? A video, moving to your second question, a video calling for the bombardment of all Egyptian churches where Christians are praying was put on the internet and was kept there for about 1 month. Only when we brought this to the attention of an international conference that coincidentally was held in Cairo and I used to chair it. Only then the countries that are hosting the headquarters of these companies closed it down. Can you imagine that ISIS is recruiting thousands of people on the internet openly and publicly? They are. So we need to work together on many of these things. And believe me, there is a very positive reception. Even those of us who used to do mistakes by mistaking some of those organizations with the terrorist ones already recognize their problem. As far as Christians in Muslim world, actually, I only can speak, of course, of my country. But Christians are now at the forefront of this fight against terrorism because simply ISIS would like to scare them off and leave Egypt. This is exactly what they are calling in these open videos. And it is the Egyptian government, and I like very much what Ms. Armstrong said about the role of the state. And we need strong states to defend against those terrorists who would like also to drive a wedge between us, between Muslims and Christians, by blowing up a church. Oh, whoever blew it up, like the Manchester guy, he carries an Egyptian, a Muslim name, Muhammad, Abadi, you name it. But he is against me as much he is against you. This is I think my whole point is, please don't mistake the 1.6 billion Muslims for the few dozens who are doing these atrocities. You are helping them. Let us work together to fight them and to eliminate our world from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you allow me, before coffee break, we take last 2 questions. Will that be okay for you? The mic is coming. Over there.
Good morning. My name is Michael Itrich, and I would like to understand one thing, as if the true Islam is a peaceful religion, And at the same time, it was said that 90% of the victims of terrorism are Muslims, yes? So how can we understand the problem between Shia and Sunni? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, that's a clear question, please. Stasa.
Okay, problem between Sunni and Shia. For centuries, there was no problem between Sunni and Shia. Shiism is very similar in its origins to Sufism, and they often have the same heroes because it's a sort of mystical thing. And it was quite possible to be a Sufi and participate in Shia devotions. Politics is what started all this off. In the 16th, 17th centuries, the Muslims set up 3 major empires. In India, the Mughal Empire, the Safavid Empire in Iran, and the Ottoman Empire. And each of them, of course, were competing for territories in the way that empires always do. The Ottomans took as their watchword an aggressive Sunni watchword and said that they were going to implement Sharia law. They never managed to do it because Sharia law is actually very anti-establishment. But that was their war cry, and the Iranians, even though Iran was at that time largely a Sunni country, said we are Shia, and the Shia were practiced a sort of slightly oddball populist Shiism, but they're competing for territory. And so the rhetoric starts building. Now, what's happened in the current world is again very political. The British and the French set up these countries with really unstable borders and odd populations. We almost set them up to fail, frankly, because we were still hoping to maintain some level of control over these runaway colonies of ours. So in Lebanon, for example, they put a Christian ruler in charge, and the Sunni population of Lebanon were keen to sort of, the Arab population were keen to meld with the Middle East, but the Lebanese Christians wanted to go to Europe. So there was an immediate divide, a political divide. And the Sunni in the north were more sophisticated, more into the urban modern lifestyle than the impoverished south. And so there begins to be a tension there. In Iraq, we British put a Sunni ruler in charge of a largely Shia population. Again, tension. And that was exacerbated with the first Sunni Shia problems after the British and Americans left Iraq. Cropped up not because of religious problems, but because the Shia government was distributing the oil revenues unfairly. These are largely political problems. What's happening now, too, is a major struggle for the control of the Middle East. Just as Europeans, for centuries during the so-called wars of religion, fought for hegemony in Europe. And 2 world wars, as I mentioned earlier, were fought for the control of Europe between people many of whom were so-called Christians, or Protestants, or Catholics, or whatever. What's happened is since the Iranian Revolution, which seized the imagination of the whole Muslim world, whether it was Sunni or Shia, because it was a declaration of independence. Independence is crucial to modernity. Our modernity happened with declarations of independence on all fronts, intellectual, political, religious, because people needed to be free in order to innovate financially and commercially, and did not need to be supervised by a state or a church. So freedom was the watchword. In the Middle East, the modern economy came not with independence, but with colonial subjugation, and that has skewed the entire modernization process. Iran threw off that American control, and this seized the imagination of the Muslim world. Saudis, who saw themselves as the leaders of the Muslim world because they are the guardians of Mecca and Medina, are determined to regain control. So you've got, and this has exacerbated the entire Sunni Shia problem in the region. Each of these faiths had to come to terms with the problem of the state again, which is always a state, however much we trumpet our love of equality and justice, we never managed to achieve it. And when the Muslim Empire was set up, the Muslim Empire was, like every single empire, egalitarian. And Muslims didn't just sit around saying, oh, Lord, you know, well, that's what can we do? They discussed this. And you have the Shia who presented a piety of protest, calling for Muslim values, the egalitarian spirit of the Quran against the imperial government. And the Sunni who said, yes, look, we agree, this is not what we wanted, it's not what the Quran says, but in the interests of peace, we have to somehow live with this in a sort of way. And that's the origin of the Sunni-Shia divide. It's about justice. And they developed different spiritualities, but the problem has been exacerbated, if I can just summarize, first by the political powers, in the imperial political powers in the early modern period, then by the colonial powers who manipulated this, and finally, since the Iranian Revolution, you've got a competition for the leadership of the Muslim world between Iran and the Saudis, who form, I must say, a very odd form of Islam. It goes back to the 18th century only, a sort of maverick form of Sunni practice that's different from that of the rest of the world. And and they are aggressively with us, with our international support, because of the oil, have been promoting this form of Islam all over the Muslim world. And that has also exacerbated the situation.
Thank you very much. Next question.
So I don't know if we are able to get answers for this, but my name is Clara Bernatova. I'm from the Faculty of Social Sciences. I would like to ask our guests here about your understanding of the link of internal policies of your countries, Muslim majority countries, and extremism. It has been mentioned vis-à-vis the Christian and some of the religious minorities, but I would like to address it more widely and raise issues of and problems of torture, arbitrary arrests, suppression of basically all the freedoms you could name, years of pretrial detention, and pursuing those who are trying to deal with these violations. I'm just thinking if you do not see a link between these policies and actually fueling extremism, while you yourself are talking about some of the ideas for fighting it. Because, you know, it does hinder...
We are really running out of the time. So.
Yes, it hinders our efforts in the Czech Republic of those who are really interested in fighting Islamophobia. But with the current policies in your countries, let's face it, it is very difficult. Thank you.
Okay, it's truly very broad, and maybe we might leave it for a coffee break, for discussion, or if you want to briefly answer it in 1 minute, please.
Were you asking me this? Oh, I thought you... Yes.
Well, I try maybe to answer shortly, but first of all, the aim of this conference is not to say that we are good, I mean, Islamic countries, and somebody is bad, no. The aim is, as I said, to shed light on some aspects of Islam, on relationship, positive side of relationship between the Czech Republic and Muslim countries individually, and also to fight stereotypes and Islamophobia. I don't think, I mean, every country, perhaps every ambassador should speak about the problems in their own countries. And indeed, there are huge problems. You mentioned human rights, women's rights, and some other political system. I think with the complex of issues, perhaps it needs the whole separate conference or at least one panel to discuss that. But here, as you know, I would like to refer again to what the Egyptian ambassador, my colleague, told. It's not like putting, we would like to put also, and I think Ms. Armstrong also to put that in the context, historical context, geopolitical context. Things that you're saying, the torture, human rights abuses, it didn't happen individually in one country separately. If actually we have to fight all those abuses together. If something happened in, I don't know, you think that it's happened in Azerbaijan, some human rights abuses, I don't know, in some other countries, Egypt, and you name it, or I don't know, some other countries. We should fight. And the same, we should fight the torture abuses like it happened in Abu Ghraib by American soldiers. It's indeed, I would like to refer to Senator John McCain saying how we came in the United States in 21st century even to discuss the possibility of legitimizing torture. This is what during the George W. Bush administration, in a way, basically blessed waterboarding. That's the form of torture. I think that kind of the phenomenon undermines the efforts of human rights defenders in Muslim countries too, because those people, those who recruit terrorists, Muslim terrorists, like, to fight, you know, and to commit terror acts, they're saying, okay, look what Western countries do. What if they need to conduct torture, they do it. But they then comes and preach us about the human rights. I think it's the all common task to fight torture, human rights abuses, and ethnic or religious minority abuses. It's our task to do, but here in the Czech Republic, it's your task, including you personally, to fight against abuses towards religious minority, including Muslims.
Thank you very much, and we are like 25 minutes late, so I really have to close the discussion now. I'd like to invite you for a coffee break downstairs, and please be back in 10 minutes, if I may kindly ask you. And if there are still some questions unanswered, please leave it for tete-a-tete discussions during the coffee break. Thank you very much.